of a sudden there was this gigantic boom.
And all hell broke loose.
I believe that we were all going to die.
It's every passenger's worst fear.
We were in the water up to our knees, and it was just freezing cold.
But many people do live to tell the tale.
Absolutely, accidents are survivable.
The key is knowing what to do.
That's when you need to have your wits about you.
I know I need to figure out where the exit roads are.
And when to do it.
Evacuate now!
Because you never know. It's right at the very last second that everything happens.
July 6th, 2013. Aircraft debris litters the main runway at San Francisco International Airport. A burned-out hull is all that's left of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 after a devastating crash landing.
Asiana 214 heavy emergency vehicles are responding. We have everyone on their way.
Cell phone video captures the terrifying scene moments after impact.
In your head, everything goes into slow motion. You just don't believe it's happening. You don't know if you're going to be dead at the end of the slow motion or not.
The Asiana crew rushes to get passengers off the plane.
My brain was very clear and I planned what I had to do immediately. Actually, I was not thinking, but acting. As soon as I heard emergency escape, I conducted the evacuation.
In their mind, it was like their training was flashing in front of them. It just became second nature.
The Asiana evacuation is remarkably successful. Of the 307 people on board, 304 make it out alive, revealing a surprising truth about serious aviation accidents. If you're ever in one, chances are you'll survive.
We know, as a result of studies that have been done, that 80%, at least 80% of the accidents are survivable.
Barbara Dunn is an aviation safety consultant and former flight attendant.
We take our job very seriously. We take our safety role very seriously. I think if you asked any member of a cabin crew what their primary function on board the aircraft was, they would tell you that it was a safety role.
But how do flight attendants master that role? How do they become survival experts? The answer is behind the doors of a facility passengers rarely get to see.
According to my practice, the best training is a practical training. That's why there is a cabin emergency evacuation trainer of Airbus 320.
Richard Kubelka is the chief cabin crew instructor at the Czech Airlines Training Center in Prague. It's one of only a few facilities in the industry that offers realistic cabin emergency training.
The cabin emergency evacuation trainer is not a real aircraft. It's a mock-up. It's a model.
The 28-ton simulator has two emergency slides, one at the forward door, the other at the overwing exit. Inside, there are 40 seats with overhead bins and realistic lighting.
We can simulate all kinds of flights, a normal flight or some non-standard situation.
Leading today's session is cabin instructor Tomáš Šlupak.
Okay, the seats please.
Šlupak is preparing 11 young flight attendants for the worst.
All the training and all the practical drills have to be performed quickly and safely.
They'll take turns being passengers and crew members on a series of simulated disasters.
So we are ready for the flight. I'm pressing start button. That means the engines are starting now.
From the control room at the back of the simulator, Richard Kubelka initiates a scenario.
We are now taking off.
The simulator's powerful hydraulic lift system comes to life.
The hydraulic system simulates the movement of the aircraft, so we can shake the cabin during the training to simulate a real situation during the flight.
Please fasten your seatbelts. We are flying through turbulent area just now.
In the cabin, it looks, feels, and sounds exactly like a real flight.
The training has to be as realistic as possible in order to prepare you for anything that might happen on the aircraft.
I press landing button. That means we are landing now. Nobody knows that something will happen in a few minutes. It is also called an unprepared emergency situation.
Most of our accidents take place during takeoff or landing, and they are unprepared. You don't know it's going to happen. Often passengers bury themselves in a newspaper or a book. Some of them go to sleep, and that's when you need to have your wits about you.
In August 2005, the cabin crew of Air France Flight 358 needed not only their wits, but nerves of steel.
Landing. Autopilot, auto thrust off.
Their A340 descends through heavy wind and pounding rain to Toronto's Pearson International Airport. The pilots struggle to put the plane on the runway.
Put it down. Put it down.
This landing was more intense and harder than any time I've ever landed in another aircraft.
The bumpiness of the landing would have caught everybody's attention. The fact that they were landing in a bad storm would have heightened the awareness.
It's a very difficult landing. Everyone started clapping, and even the lady who sitting next to me, I remember very clearly, she said, "No, wow, that was an amazing landing." And as soon as she finished that sentence, then all hell broke loose.
We started the plane started violently going up and down.
Then, as it speeds down the runway at 148 kilometers an hour, Flight 358 runs out of room.
At that point that I believed that we were all going to die. It was obvious that no one can survive this kind of thing.
I thought this was it.
As the smell of jet fuel fills the cabin, panic begins to spread. The plane is now a deadly fire trap.
The fire started in the aft end of the aircraft. People in the front didn't realize the severity of the situation. So the people in the front of the aircraft were not as motivated to get out as quickly until there was an announcement made by one of the crew members in the back end of the aircraft. She motivated people to get moving and get out.
In an instant, the flight attendant's cordial demeanor is gone.
We're trained to be forceful, and we're trained to completely forget about the service aspect of our job and focus just on safety.
People were crawling over the seats, they were pushing each other, they were just basically all for yourself.
If they can't control the panic,
Open the door! Open the door!
the crush of frightened passengers could quickly turn into a deadly stampede. 197 passengers are in a desperate struggle to escape the burning wreckage of Air France Flight 358.
Everybody was expecting the plane to blow up.
Some haven't taken any of the simple precautions safety experts recommend.
Making sure that you wear lace-up shoes and not a shoe that is going to fly off on impact and leave you barefoot. Wearing natural fibers that don't burn as easily. Something that's made out of polyester or nylon or a synthetic fabric of some description. When it gets hot and it melts, it sticks to my skin. So if I'm wearing cotton or wool or a natural fiber, my chances of getting burned are far less.
Open the door! Open the door!
I could see the air attendant there struggling with the fact that should I or should I not open this door, because the fire was raging in front of it.
The attendant quickly makes the decision to start sending passengers down the emergency slides.
We just ran up as fast as we could, thorns and like through whatever was left of the ground where the plane was.
Astonishingly, every single passenger and the entire crew of Flight 358 make it out alive.
In their report, the Transportation Safety Board praised the crew very highly for the job that they did and attributed the fact that everybody got out to the actions of the cabin crew.
We really need to take seriously those safety commands and evacuation information, because you never know. It was a perfect flight. There's not any indications that anything can go wrong, and it's right at the very last second that everything happens.
We have to evacuate now.
The success of the Air France evacuation had everything to do with speed. It took just 90 seconds to get everyone off the plane. That amazingly short length of time is in fact the target that all crews aim for. Any moment now, the Czech Airlines trainees will be up against that clock.
So the cabin must be clear in 1 minute and 30 seconds.
The hydraulic lift rocks the cabin, simulating a hard emergency landing.
Evacuate, evacuate.
Seatbelts off! Seatbelts off! Leave everything!
Our evacuation commands are designed to get people up and moving and towards the exit and out of the airplane.
The slide on this simulator is already extended, so to keep the timing realistic, flight attendants must wait until they hear the sound of the slide being inflated.
Leave everything! Come this way! Jump and slide! Jump and slide!
It is recommended to cross your hands when you are sliding to protect yourself.
Jump and slide!
We do what's called looping. We repeat over and over and over and over again until we are sure that everybody who can get out is out.
The looping helps combat a psychological phenomenon known in the industry as negative panic.
That's when people freeze in their seats and they don't want to move. Instead of getting up and rushing towards an exit, they just sit there and wait for somebody to tell them what to do.
Research video has shown that while some passengers freeze, others will do almost anything to get off a plane as quickly as possible. A famous study by the UK Civil Aviation Authority revealed that desperation and outright panic can take hold in seconds, even in a simulated emergency. Evacuation training teaches flight attendants how to quell that kind of panic. By playing the role of the passenger, they get at least some idea of how frightening a real emergency would be.
This simulator is the state-of-art of technology to train the future cabin crews. I feel that if in real life something happens, I will really know what to do.
But what happens when disaster strikes in mid-air? Getting off a plane at cruising altitude is not an option. One harrowing flight from Alaska reveals why cabin crews have only seconds to react to explosive decompression. The low atmospheric pressure outside the cabin poses a risk. Our bodies are simply not designed for such extreme altitudes. Normally, the aircraft protects us. Today, the A320 simulator will show what happens when that protection fails.
Now, next topic is rapid decompression. When the masks are dropping down, you have to use them immediately.
The passenger's cabin is pressurized. So that means at cruising altitude, there is a higher pressure inside the cabin than outside. We are climbing to the cruising altitude.
Any breach in the fuselage at cruising altitude causes an instant depressurization, leading to a scene that would look and sound something like this.
Ah, something happened. Taking the mask.
the mask and use them.
It could be caused by a window blowing out, an aircraft door opening. It could be caused by a propeller coming through the fuselage. There's any number of reasons that could cause it, but it's a rapid loss of cabin pressure.
Oxygen masks are critical, as most of the air in the cabin gets sucked out by the difference in pressure.
Above the heads of the passengers, there is a chemical generator. If we pull down any mask which is connected to the chemical generator, the generator will come on and produce 100% of oxygen for approximately 12 or 15 minutes.
If all goes well, 15 minutes of oxygen buys the pilots enough time to descend to an altitude where the masks are no longer needed.
For us, it's important to know this shock, when the masks are falling down, and to react, to take it on, and to try to give the information to the passengers to pull the mask down and use them.
Rapid decompression emergencies are extremely rare, affecting less than 1 in a million commercial flights each year. In June 1983, Revolution 8 became one of those rare flights. 10 passengers are flying from Cold Bay, Alaska.
We were headed to Seattle. It was a beautiful day. It was clear, no turbulence. Highly unusual, highly unusual.
In the cockpit, Captain James Gibson and his crew have noticed something unusual as well. Not with the weather, but with their plane.
You hear that, Gare?
I do. Not sure. I noticed that the vibration that I was feeling in my feet and the vibration that was in the glass was different. And that's the first time I'd ever come across that. And I thought, well, this is a little different.
Well, Moose, have a look, would you?
Yeah, you bet.
As Gibson and Gary Lintner wait for Moose Lauren to report back, the vibrations become more pronounced.
I distinctly remember looking down and seeing my control yoke shaking. And I turned to Jim and I said, Jesus, look at this. And Jim and I are kind of looking at each other across the cockpit. And finally he says,
oh, screw this. Let's turn around.
The engineer said, I want you to come back and check number 4 engine and see if you can see anything. And just as I looked out the window, the engine went. As the prop came off, I thought, oh crap, it's gonna kill me. It's gonna cut me in two. But it flew forward and then it came back and slapped the engine and then went underneath.
The prop tears a hole in the bottom of the plane.
Things would start to fly around. Anything that wasn't battened down would be probably heading towards the hole in the fuselage and disappearing very quickly.
I gotta go! I grabbed a hold of the cargo net and looked down at my foot. And, my heart dropped to my feet. Fear just ran through me. I looked straight down at my foot over a hole, straight down to the ocean. I can actually, to this day, see the ocean, that view. The color, the white caps.
The hole is more than half a meter wide.
That scared the crap out of me.
The gash in the fuselage has caused an explosive decompression.
And then, of course, the cockpit gets all foggy, and there's almost no sound. Your eardrums are popped.
Cabin pressure dropping.
So when you try to breathe it, you end up getting lightheaded and you can actually pass out.
It's a little disconcerting because the fog and it's quiet. You think, geez, am I dead or not?
Depending on what altitude you're at and depending on how explosive the decompression is, you may have, slightly longer than at other times, but you will eventually die from lack of oxygen.
Junior flight attendant Victoria Fredenhagen springs into action.
After the explosions, I wasn't sure what had happened. But I got up and got the oxygen walk-around bottle, put that on.
Jim and I got our mask on, and within seconds, Moose came through the cockpit door and said, "Holy crap, we just lost number 4 propeller."
The rupture in the fuselage has damaged critical flight controls. The crew needs to descend to a lower altitude where there's more oxygen, but the yoke is slow to respond.
It felt like the yoke was in concrete. It just felt solid as a concrete block.
Calm down, just a second.
Jim saw that the autopilot disconnect lights were on, and he reached over and turned the autopilot back on again. And I personally thought that was probably one of the smartest things that anybody ever did in the history of aviation.
The autopilot can do what the pilots could not.
Wings level.
Steer the plane.
Descending to 10,000.
It's a struggle, but they finally get their Electra L-188 down to 10,000 feet.
Okay, stable. Rebate. Holding at 10,000 feet. Over.
Thank God.
The passengers are no longer in danger of hypoxia.
It's now safe to remove your masks.
There was no real emergency because we could sense that everything was good.
Everybody's fine back here! Well, there's, of course, adrenaline running at that point. It just felt good. I think it was just surreal because we were okay.
Revolution 8 makes it to safety. The close call is a good example of the dual role that all cabin crews play.
When you become a flight attendant, you perform a balancing act every time you go to work because the passengers look at you as a service provider, which is what you are, and you're supposed to be gracious and kind and helpful, and yet lurking in the background is always the fact that something might happen and you may have to introduce your safety skills.
At the Czech Airlines Training Center,
Just now we'll practice the most complicated case, firefighting during the in-flight service.
the team of young flight attendants is ready to test what may be the most crucial safety skill of all, fighting fire.
Fire is very, very frightening on an airplane because there's nowhere to go. In a house, if you have a house fire, you can go outside and you get away from the fire. You can't do that on an airplane.
And you can't call the fire department. The cabin crew must respond in seconds or face an unstoppable inferno. A320 simulator.
So service is in progress. We have a wonderful meal today.
Meal service training is about to get a lot more exciting, thanks to an automated smoke generator.
We can simulate the in-flight fire using smoke in the cabin. We can choose the place, for example, inside the lavatory, inside the galley, under the seat, or in the overhead compartment.
As wisps of smoke start to appear in the cabin, the crew springs into action, clearing the aisle and grabbing the protective smoke hood and fire extinguisher that are stored on all A320s.
Perfect.
It's very important to start a cooperation between cabin attendants and flight crew members. So let's say that the first cabin attendant will start firefighting procedures. The second cabin attendant will call the flight crew members.
Captain, there's a fire in the cabin. We started the firefighting.
And the other cabin attendants will take care about passengers.
Improvised filters.
You can get them to breathe through something so that you're filtering some of the smoke and the toxic particles out.
Was it extinguished? Okay, right.
The experience inside is very, very realistic.
It's quite heavy and it's very difficult to orient in the smoke in the cabin and see the people around and try to extinguish the fire.
If putting out a simulated fire in a simulated plane is difficult, imagine facing the real thing at 30,000 feet. June 1983. All is not well aboard Air Canada Flight 797.
The Air Canada DC-9 was a watershed accident.
41 passengers are beginning to suffocate.
The aircraft was at cruise altitude, and there was smoke discovered coming from one of the rear washrooms.
The smoke is getting thicker, but the crew can't find the source.
Incredibly harsh smoke that was really irritating your throat. You had to take really small breaths, otherwise you would choke.
I was crying and scared. I wasn't hysterical. The gentleman sitting next to me explained to me that if I would not cry and if I could, conserve my, not breathe so fast, that it would conserve the oxygen, would help us, and not to worry, that the flight attendants, they really know how to handle these sort of situations.
The crew may lack the more advanced fire training of today's crews, but the Flight 797 attendants know to hand out wet towels to help filter the smoke.
There is no ventilation, or very little ventilation, and you can't open a window or a door to let the smoke out.
In the cockpit, the pilots have managed to reroute the flight and are preparing for an emergency landing in Cincinnati.
Approach, Air Canada 797.
In 1983, it's not standard procedure to instruct passengers how to open the emergency doors. But in this case, the flight attendants take the initiative.
Down to get as far away from the plane as possible.
You are clear to land. You are 4 miles.
From the time that the smoke was discovered until the aircraft touched down in Cincinnati, I believe was 17 minutes, which was pretty remarkable when you consider that they had to find an airport to land in.
When we touch the ground, I assume that we're safe now. Now let's get out of this airplane.
But dense smoke is filling the cabin. Getting off the aircraft suddenly seems more difficult than anyone could have imagined.
I got up out of my seat, and I remember putting my hands up on someone's back, and it was like waiting in a line. And I knew that was one line I didn't want to wait very long.
Sergio Benetti swings open a cabin door of the smoke-filled Air Canada DC-9. He helps gasping passengers escape. Passengers struggle to find their way out, even with the doors open. The exits are all but invisible. The smoke is too thick.
I saw a light, and it was the door that had opened. Someone had opened the door. I realized what it was. I ran to the door and held my head. I just put my face out so I could breathe.
Passengers who have found the exits slide off the wing and stumble to safety. On the ground, flight attendants direct passengers out of harm's way.
Off the wing! Get off the wing!
Fire rescue vehicles surround the plane. Before everyone can get off, the entire cabin ignites.
Something called flashover occurred, which is what happens when the fire builds up and then the oxygen comes in from the outside.
Captain Donald Cameron and First Officer Claude Ouimet make it off.
We knew there were people in the airplane, unfortunately, at that point. That was finished.
The cabin fire breaks through the top of the fuselage. Black smoke can be seen for kilometers. Flight attendant Laura Kayama begins to count.
I will remember these words forever. She told us to line up so that she could count the survivors. If there were survivors, obviously they were dead.
There were 46 people on board, including the crew, and 23 people didn't make it out.
It's just a shame we didn't get everybody off. It still bothers me.
When the fire department and the investigators went into the aircraft afterwards, they found passengers on their hands and knees aft of the overwing exits, facing aft. So clearly they had crawled back there looking for exits and didn't find them. A, because they probably didn't know where they were, and in those days they weren't marked well. You need to have a rough idea of how many feet it is to your nearest exit and to an alternate exit, and how you're going to get there if the cabin's full of smoke. So you just need to be aware.
The tragedy of Air Canada Flight 797 leads to significant safety improvements in the airline industry.
We got floor-level lighting, we got automatic fire extinguishers in the washrooms, we got huge improvements in flight attendant training and firefighting.
The cabin crew's impromptu decision to show passengers how to open the overwing exits is adopted as a routine safety measure.
It was a huge accident for us with respect to improvements in the industry, and we've saved lives because of it.
Better fire training means that today's flight attendants get to actually feel the heat.
We need to train cabin attendants how to fight a real fire. That's why the firefighting simulator is important for the training.
The firefighting trainer doesn't move. It's made of solid steel and is completely fireproof.
Welcome. Well, come in. Thank you.
It can simulate 3 types of onboard fire: a galley fire, overhead compartment fire, and fire from below the floor, one that might originate in the cargo hold.
Okay. So put your smoke hood on, please.
For some trainees, it's the first time they've had to fight a cabin fire while wearing restrictive gear.
For new employees, it's very important to realize that the in-flight fire, it's a very difficult situation.
You have the extinguisher.
The drill is carried out with a water-filled extinguisher.
Okay, short burst and close it.
On an actual flight, they'd be using even more effective halon gas extinguishers.
Close it. Check once more, please. Don't be afraid, you can be closer. Right. Good. Good experience. Well, you can remove the remote.
It's the kind of training Barbara Dunn wishes she'd had.
Next one, please.
When she began her career as a flight attendant.
When I was hired in 1971, we had no simulators at all. Our firefighting training consisted of firing off a water extinguisher into a garbage can, and that's it.
Don't be afraid, come closer.
So it's changed dramatically. The training process is comprehensive now.
Okay, that's all. Good doing. Good. Next one, please.
Each flight attendant will face the flames before moving on to the most physically demanding drill of all: water survival training.
We need to train all cabin attendants as well as flight crew members what to do in case of ditching. Ditching means landing on the water.
More than 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered in water. When a plane goes down at sea, passengers face an incredibly challenging ordeal. Those lucky enough to survive the impact will then have to survive in the open sea. Wearing a life vest could make all the difference if you know how and when to use it.
You don't want to inflate your vest until after you've left the aircraft. We don't want the aircraft filling up with water and you having your life jacket on floating at the top. You're not going to be able to dive down with a life jacket on. So you're really much better off to wait until you get outside and then pull your inflation toggles.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on water survival training.
The training begins with a quick lesson on how to safely jump into the water from a ditched plane.
Position is like this.
That's important. An injured flight attendant can't be much help to passengers.
And the purpose of this position is protecting your important parts of the body and my head against the sharp objects into any water. Is it clear? Yeah. Let's go. Yes. Now we have to keep the energy-saving position. Cross your arms and legs and bend.
Ocean water temperatures can be frigid, as low as 10 degrees Celsius across much of the Atlantic. Flight attendants learn to preserve body heat to ward off hypothermia.
And stay in such position as long as necessary.
All long-haul flights over water are equipped with life rafts. Some, like this one, are slide rafts, evacuation slides that convert to a raft.
Please, just now we will board the slide raft.
They carry up to 70 people, but they are next to useless if you don't know how to get in quickly and safely.
Use all of the red loops.
In order to be seaworthy, the raft needs sturdy side walls that rise a meter above the surface. Anyone trying to board from the water must negotiate a flimsy fabric ladder.
You'd have to be in good shape to get into a slide raft, or very motivated.
Even with help from those already on board, it's a physically demanding challenge. All the more reason to put flight attendants through it on a regular basis.
New employees, they usually say to me that the practical training is much more difficult for them than they expected.
Though water ditchings are rare, perhaps the most famous aviation emergency of all time ended with passengers fearing for their lives on the open water. January 2009. U.S. Airways Flight 1549 departs New York's LaGuardia Airport. There are 150 passengers on board, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina.
The aircraft took off uneventfully, and very shortly after takeoff they lost all engines as a result of birds.
I caught something out of the corner of my eye, and slightly to our right, but still ahead of us, was a line of birds. And they were very, very close, too close for us to maneuver around. Whoa! And that fast, we were just on top of them.
And then all of a sudden, there was this gigantic boom. It seemed like it stopped in midair, like you hit a brick wall. And then all of a sudden, somebody said, "The left engine's on fire."
Uh-oh. We got one roll, both of them rolling back.
Both engines rolled back to idle.
There was very little time to warn the cabin. There was no time, actually. The captain and the first officer were busy trying to control the airplane. They were trying to figure out where they were going to land.
First levers. After quickly assessing the situation, Captain Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles realized that without engine power, they're not going to make it to any nearby airport.
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I thought to myself, great, the Hudson River was our best opportunity. It was really the only thing in sight where we could land this airplane.
Let's go. Put the flaps on. Brace for impact.
What does he mean, brace for impact? I had no idea about how to brace for impact.
You need to be aware of your brace position. In many, many accidents, the cabin crew are trying desperately to get the passengers into the brace position, but because the passengers haven't read the safety features card, they don't know what that means.
Get your heads down and stay down!
Proper brace position is knees together, feet flat on the floor, body bent as far forward as possible, with arms wrapped under the legs or braced against the seat in front of you.
Your body's going to be thrown forward, so if you can get yourself into that position beforehand, the amount of movement back and forth is going to be reduced and the level of injury will be less.
In the cabin, the passengers prepare for the inevitable.
All the passengers really started kind of pulling together, and somebody yelled out as we were going down,
"You ready at the doors?"
The folks at the door says, "We're ready."
Clay Presley does what all passengers should. He stays calm and tries to think ahead.
So I started thinking about, if we're going to crash, I know I need to figure out where the exit rows are. If the water comes in, you need to be able to hold your breath long enough to get to those 4 or 5 rows and get the doors open if you can.
But before anyone can escape, they must first survive a high-speed impact.
We're going to brace.
Into freezing cold water. Airways 1549 speeds towards the Hudson River.
looked like the airplane was going right for the bottom of the Hudson River. All we saw was water cascading over the windshield.
It was like a tornado. Pieces of the plane were being torn apart. Some people were thrown around pretty good.
Then the airplane popped up, and it was just sort of gently rocking in the waves.
In an instant, the $75 million plane has become an unlikely boat floating down the Hudson River. It's now filling with freezing water.
That water was cold. It was very cold, so your feet are freezing.
You land in the Hudson in the middle of the winter, the water is going to be very cold and you're going to suffer from hypothermia very quickly. Their feet and their hands will get numb. They're going to be useless.
Passengers nearest the exits open the doors.
I just jumped up very quickly and started making my way to the emergency door. And so I worked my way out onto the wing, just a few steps to start with.
Fortunately, they had slide rafts rather than just slides, so what they were able to do was evacuate passengers into the slide rafts.
At the back of the plane, water continues pouring in. Flight attendants direct passengers forward.
Go over the seats if you have to.
We were actually in the water, up to our knees, and it was just absolutely freezing cold. Every part of your body that was in that water just ached to the bone.
Come forward! Is there anybody here?
We were very confident there was nobody left on the airplane.
Since the plane came down near Midtown Manhattan, it's not long before rescuers are on the scene.
I saw the first ferry, and I could see the wheelhouse. I felt like, okay, we're really going to be okay. There was a sigh of relief.
In the end, all 150 passengers and the entire crew of Flight 1549 are brought to safety. Another example of how serious aviation accidents often end well.
Absolutely, accidents are survivable. The next time a passenger gets on an airplane, I want them to be aware of their surroundings. I want them to know where they're sitting, how they're going to get to an exit if they have to. You also need to do your seatbelt up so tight that it's uncomfortable, because that's the only thing that's going to keep you in your seat and keep you restrained properly.
Seats at the front of the plane are often close to the point of impact when a plane hits the ground, leading many experts to believe the safest seat during an accident is one near the back of the plane.
Obviously, sitting near an exit is a good idea, but that exit may not be usable in this particular scenario. So I would say, rather than choosing where you're going to sit, be aware of where you are sitting.
For flight crews and passengers alike, there's one more important statistic. The odds of dying in a plane crash are incredibly small, less than 1 in 10 million. That means that this Czech Airlines flight crew, and every other crew around the world, will almost certainly never need to draw on their well-honed safety skills. But if disaster does strike, passengers can rest easy knowing their cabin crew has the skill to get them out alive.